further delay, why don't we get going and others can come in as they are able.
Okay.
So again, everyone, this is Dana Hall. I've already mentioned my role with Aula. I'm very pleased this evening to have a leading member, maybe a founding member,
Down
Carrie,
in the left-hand corner, you'll see your microphone.
a founding member of the Cornell Hemlock Initiative. And Carrie is being especially helpful bringing us along and patiently answering my questions and stuff. So Carrie, I'll let you introduce yourself and talk about your many qualifications, but I want to thank you in advance for your time this evening and again, continued patience as we ask you questions.
It's my pleasure. I look forward to lots of questions. Our director, Mark Whitmore, who works in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell, was our founder. I'm the project manager for the Hemlock Initiative. I've been there since 2015. And I want to thank Aula for having me here tonight to talk to you guys. And there was a list of other people I was supposed to add on. But we also partner with the Finger Lakes Prism. Can you guys show of hands how many people are familiar with the Prism? Great. And our funders are the New York State DEC, the U.S. Forest Service, USDA APHIS, and the EPA. We have at least one person on the call who is not super familiar with hemlock trees. Is that accurate?
Come on, you might as well confess your sins.
Sue, I think it was you.
Okay, I see it, and at least 2 or 3. So let's talk about how you pick out a hemlock from all your other trees. Hemlocks have this rough gray bark that is deeply furrowed. It makes big chunks, kind of like oak bark. And it's this grayish brown, although as they get bigger, the underbark starts to show, and the underbark is reddish. And so the big old hemlocks actually have a reddish cast to their bark. The foliage is this lacy, feathery, evergreen foliage. And the evergreen is extra important, so I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The needles are short and flat. They're shiny and dark green on top and a lighter on the bottom. And they have these rounded tips, sometimes almost notched, but mostly rounded tips. And you can see that can you see my cursor?
Yes.
They're coming out opposite each other on the twig, and they're also in this sort of flattened X pattern. Sometimes people mistake balsam fir for hemlock, but those come out all the way around in a spiral pattern. And the hemlock have these distinctive whitish stripes on the underside that's really helps you pick them out from other things. Really, they're pretty different from most of the hemlocks, most of the evergreens you're going to see in your area, which are going to be spruces and firs and pines with the long needles or very spiky needles. The cones are small, maybe 2.5 inches across. They have these rounded scales. They're brown when they're mature. When they're just growing, you'll see that they're almost a blue-green, and the scales are really tightly closed at that time. So those are hemlocks. Their overall shape, the branches are very flexible, and so they droop a little bit, which also helps differentiate them from our other conifers. And even the leader, the very top branch, is often a little tilted. So they have this very open, lacy look and a little relaxed profile. They're what we call a foundation species. You might have heard of a keystone species, which would be a top predator that helps manage an ecosystem from the top down. The foundation species is a very, very common, usually plant species that forms the foundation of an ecosystem. Without those species, you don't have the same ecosystem. You can think of them as habitat building blocks. They fill a pretty unique niche, particularly for an evergreen. They often grow on steep slopes and in shady areas. They're actually our most shade adapted evergreen. They're so good at dealing with little tiny moments of light that you'll see they often hold their branches way down low, even in the middle of a forest canopy, because their needles can pick those little sun flecks out of dappled shade and photosynthesize with that. So they're really well adapted for pretty deep shade, which makes them very unique compared to our other evergreens, and even compared to a lot of our hardwoods. They provide habitat and food for over 400 forest species, birds, mammals, arthropods, lots of spiders, more diversity of spiders in the canopy than in the hardwood forest. But possibly more importantly to this audience, they're really, really good shelter. The interior of a hemlock stand is 10 degrees cooler than the air above it in the summertime because the shade is so dense. In the wintertime, there's a little bit less snow under it because the evergreen needles shed some of the snow outwards, and it's also less windy and it's warmer than it is out in the rest of the ecosystem. And so a lot of things come to hemlock stands to seek shelter, both in the winter and in the summer, including deer. They provide a lot of ecosystem services, and you might not usually think of a tree as being important for aquatic ecosystems, but hemlocks really play a pretty big role in our aquatic ecosystem functioning. The snow that they have underneath their canopies stays on the ground later into the spring than the snow around it because they're evergreen and they have this great shade. And that means you've got colder water running off into your streams later into the spring, and that helps stabilize stream temperatures. They also, because they're evergreen, they're taking up water in the spring and the fall when we have an overabundance of water. And in the summertime, when we don't have enough water, they are not very active because as opposed to the hardwood trees, which are not so active in the spring and fall, but are very actively taking up water in the summertime. So what we've seen is that across the eastern seaboard, watersheds that are infested, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but watersheds that are infested with hemlock woolly adelgid have flashier streams, which means that they flood more in the spring and fall, and then they get lower during drought events. So they help stabilize streams, they help keep them cold, and they have these big root systems that help clean water on its way down to the stream. So they provide, also their needles take forever to decompose, hundreds of years sometimes, and they make this deep, deep duff that can be hundreds of years old before the needles fully decompose. So they make this really distinctive soil and water chemistry and temperature regimes that help support a lot of different species. For instance, I don't know if you guys have heard an alternate name for brook trout used to be hemlock trout, because there are more of them in places that have hemlocks. In the Delaware Water Gap, they found up to 3 times more trout in watersheds, small watersheds that had hemlock versus ones that didn't. Why am I not just telling this to DEC and telling them to treat more trees in our state parks? And, well, DEC would be our state forests. That's because 76% of New York's forested land is privately owned. And that means that what happens on individual owners' properties doesn't just impact the legacy of what is on that land going down to the next generation, but it really impacts the future of hemlocks and other forest species in New York. Hemlocks, I was a little surprised to hear this, but hemlocks are the 3rd most common tree in New York. And the darker green, the more hemlock in this map, and then the red, which looks brown up in these areas, that's over 60% hemlock. So there's a ton of it up in the Adirondacks and around Tug Hill and in the Catskills. Those are kind of our hot spots. And it doesn't, when you look at this map, you would think, oh, Finger Lakes don't have very many hemlock, but that's because this model didn't do a good job at picking up the hemlocks in our gorges. We have a lot of hemlock in our gorges. They don't show on the state map because, I think because the gorges are so narrow that they didn't show up in whatever aerial imagery they used to make this model. This is what we don't want to see. This is the Pisgah National Forest. We would not like to see our forests and our gorges look like this. And the reason that they are the reason the Pisgah National Forest looks like that is because of this pest, Hemlock woolly adelgid. It's an invasive pest. Let me try to frame it in by looking at where hemlock is native. In all of the places where there are Asian hemlocks, there is a native HWA. And on the west coast of North America, there is a native HWA. The only place that has hemlocks that doesn't have a Hemlock adelgid type pest is lucky us. Off the record, a little bit of hand waving. I would guess it has something to do with our glaciers, but I don't know that for sure. But we just happen to be the place where the only place in the world that had hemlocks, but not a Hemlock adelgid until about the turn of the last century when somebody brought in probably a Japanese hemlock for the ornamental trade, and HWA hitched a ride, arrived in Virginia, and it's been spreading ever since. So this is how it's been spreading in New York. It arrived in the 1980s, downstate in the city, moved up in through the Hudson Valley in the late 80s and early 90s, and it's been spreading north and west since then. It arrived, I think, in the early aughts in the Finger Lakes. And I wanted to talk, do I want to talk about that? I don't want to talk about that. So how do you figure out if you have Hemlock woolly adelgid on your property or on a tree that you're looking at in the watershed? They look like this. This is what it looks like, these little white balls on the twig right at the base of the needles. Right there. This is what the insect looks like if you peel away that wool and blow it up a bunch so you can see it really clearly. The white wool is created by these little pores here, and this crazy loop-de-loop straw thing, that is its mouth parts. And it inserts that into the twig, and then it uses it to eat the starch that the tree has stored for its own use. And it's not the eating of the starch that kills the tree. What kills the tree is the damage that's done when it puts those mouth parts in. Our hemlocks really aggressively wall that off to prevent any infection from coming in through that wound, which is not a big deal if you have one hemlock on a twig, one HWA on a twig, or 5 HWA on a twig. But if you look back at this, that's a lot. That's a lot of little wounds. And when you have this high of a pest pressure, it kills your tree because it can't get the sap out to the end of the twig, which is where it makes new growth. So it doesn't get to make any new needles, and that eventually it starves. In the South, these trees are dying in about 4 to 10 years. Up here, our winters are colder, and that does give HWA pause. And so it's more like 6 to 20 years here, depending on what kind of winter you have and depending on whether or not you're in like a frost pocket. If it gets super, super cold on your property, that you probably have closer to 10 or 15. So why does the population pressure build like this, and how is it spreading? It's really important to know that this pest has 2 generations a year. It has an overwintering generation that starts in the late spring, early summer, and it sits in an inactive state all through the summer. And then it wakes up in the fall and starts to growing, reaches maturity over winter, and then lays the spring generation. And they don't have this sort of suspended animation phase, which is called estivation. It's like hibernation, but it's not related to winter. They just go straight through, make adults, and start making eggs. This, in the place where our HWA is native, their life cycle is even more complicated with 5 generations and 2 host species, but the other host isn't here. And the important thing to take home from that is that there is no sexual reproduction in North America with HWA. All of the reproduction is asexual, which means you only need 1 HWA to settle on your tree to have a new infestation. So they hatch out of their eggs and are crawlers. And this is the only stage when they can move around and resettle. It is possible that if you brought an HWA branch with eggs on it and laid it in your forest, they would hatch and become crawlers, and then they would spread. But this is the only phase in which they're actually moving around looking for a new host. They settle on twigs and they become estivating nymphs in the summertime. That's just the overwintering generation. And they hang out, this says July to October. They're already active this year. They woke up a couple of weeks ago, so they're a little early this year because we had that cold snap early in the fall. This is what they look like, a little sesame seed with a fringe of white wool. You can see that they would be kind of hard to see. Both of these are magnified. So you can look for them in the summertime, but you might want to bring a hand lens or a magnifying glass because they're just a little difficult to find. What's not hard to find is last year's HWA because those woolly balls stick around for about another year. So you can look year round, but if you're looking for new HWA, winter is better. So once they wake up, they feed and they grow and they make this really easy to find wool all winter long, and then the next generation kind of overlaps with them. So you can see the fresh wool from November all the way into June. The adults lay 50 to 100 eggs. We pulled the wool away so you could see what was happening. This is an adult. You can see it's a lot bigger and grosser than that early, young, freshly settled nymph. And these little earwax colored balls are the eggs. So they're laying eggs in April and May. The early half of that is that overwintering generation, and then remember that second generation starts growing right away. And so by May, those second generation, the spring generation, is also laying eggs. So this is what it looks like. There's the oversummering nymphs. They wake up in the fall, they start growing until they're adults, and then they lay their eggs, which then hatch. And so these white ones are the overwintering generations, and this is the spring generation that settles on the same twig because the new growth isn't there yet for the hemlock. So you've got both generations growing, and then in late May, early June, the hemlock put on that beautiful lime green new growth. And the second generation, the spring generation, hatches just at that time and go and settle on the freshly emerged growth. So why is this an invasion? We have asexual reproduction. So one insect can start or restart an infestation. 2 generations a year, so they have two rounds of exponential growth in a year. And there are no predators, no native predators here. And that means that we get no population control. And that is why this pest is killing so many hemlocks on the East Coast that the Great Smoky Mountain National Park is now aggressively treating all of their remaining hemlock in order to preserve 1% of their original hemlocks. So speaking of treating, how do you do that? there are two avenues that will someday be available. There's chemical management and there's biological management. There are options for chemical management. There are two, let me add a little caveat here, which is that if you have a hemlock hedge, you can use horticultural oil. You just have to spray it once or twice a year, but you need to be able to spray the whole tree and cover all of the foliage in order for it to work. And that's really hard to do when you have a 75-foot tall hemlock tree. So unless you have a hedge, these two chemicals are your option. Imidacloprid is very slow acting. You apply it, and then the next year, it starts protecting your tree. It lasts for a long time. It lasts from up to 7 years. If you're really, really unlucky, it might be 4. If you're lucky, it might be 7. It just depends on sort of the condition of the tree, how well it was applied. Dinotefuran is the other option. It works right away. As soon as you apply it, it starts protecting your tree, but it burns out in a year. There are only a couple of situations where we almost always suggest using imidacloprid. There are only 2 situations where I would say using both would be good. One is if you're in an area that doesn't have HWA yet, like the infestation I'm going to tell you about soon, a little bit later. And then you want to use both because you want to make sure you kill the current generation before it lays eggs, because you're trying to stop the sort of the front line of the infestation. I don't think that applies in your area. The other reason would be if you missed the infestation when it first arrived and your tree is really, really sick and you love that tree, in which case I would encourage you to use both, because just depending on what kind of winter it is before the imidacloprid kicks in, the HWA could do a lot of damage before the imidacloprid kicks in. Does that make sense? I'm seeing nods. Okay. Imidacloprid is widely available. There is a soil drench that you can use yourself. You buy it at Lowe's or wherever, you mix it up, follow the instructions, and pour it into the ground where the roots of your tree are, which is within the drip line of your tree. The dinotefuran is can only be applied by in New York State by certified pesticide applicators. What we would encourage you to do if you have more than a couple of trees is to hire somebody to do either or both of these. Because what a pesticide applicator can do is do this, which is a basal bark application, where they go out with a backpack sprayer and they spray the first 6 feet of the trunk. And then the chemical gets absorbed through the bark and moves through the tree. We like this because if you pour the imidacloprid into the ground, it gets picked up by anything that has roots in that area, versus this, which is much more targeted. So why are we suggesting that you use a pesticide on your property? Imidacloprid is the most widely used insecticide in the world. It's what goes on to over 95% of the agricultural seed that goes into the ground in New York agriculture. It's in your flea and tick collars if you have a pet. And it's also the thing that's useful for managing HWA. The reason people use it so much is that it's a lot less toxic to mammals and humans than the other options like organophosphates, which were big 30 years ago, but nobody uses them now because these are so much safer. So this does not have a lot of off-target impacts because what it targets is the insect nervous system, which is pretty different from other classes of life. This is a really low-risk application for pollinators because hemlock are wind pollinated. They don't produce any nectar. They're not of interest to pollinators. And it's a pretty low dose application. You're not putting very much product out into your forest, and your hemlock are mixed with other trees. So you're not putting a lot of chemical on the landscape, and when you're using it on a plant that is not of interest to pollinators. And you only need to use it once every several years. So our feeling is, if you take the potential risks that are associated with using these products on your property, and you compare it to losing a foundation species in your forest, we think that, and the cascade of ecological effects that flow from that, the loss of habitat, the loss of food for many species, the changes to your stream ecosystem, we feel that using the chemicals is a lower risk route than just letting all of your hemlock die. Because right now, that's the only other option. What the lab end of the group that I work for, the Hemlock Initiative, is working on is biological control. We think this is the best long-term option because you can't treat your trees forever. It's landscape scale, which is great because we have way more hemlocks than we could manage chemically. And we think it's really the only viable solution for saving our hemlocks forests in the long term. Unfortunately, the research is still underway. Usually, development of a biological control takes about 20 years. And not just us, but the people who have been working on HWA have not been at it for 20 years yet. So we're still working on it. Before you can release a biological control into the environment, first you have to go to the place where this new pest came from and find out what its predators are. It could be a predator, it could be a pathogen, or it could be a parasite. We don't know of any parasites of HWA, and the pathogens are not specific enough to release into a new environment. The only thing that works for HWA is predators. And then you spend several years testing those species and seeing if they're going to impact any other components of the ecosystem that you're concerned about. And then once you get the permits to do research in your own location, then you can see if that predator will actually manage the pest in your landscape. So the biological controls that we're working with are Laricobius beetles, which are from the Pacific Northwest. Laricobius nigrinus is the species that we work with. We call it Little Larry when we're feeling affectionate. It's a specialist on HWA, the way that HWA is a specialist on hemlocks. And we've released about 9,000 of them in New York since 2008. These guys feed on they're active in the winter. So they're feeding on the maturing, overwintering generation. And then they reproduce and the next generation drops into the soil by the time HWA is laying eggs. The other thing we work with is silverflies. These guys are also from the Pacific Northwest, and they eat the HWA eggs, which is important because you have those two generations. So whatever you do to the winter generation, whether it gets knocked off by a cold winter or there's a predator eating it, that spring generation allows the population to bounce back. So we really need something that feeds on that spring generation. We're thinking maybe the two of them together can control HWA like they do in the Pacific Northwest. We released about 10,000 of these. That was before our releases this spring. And we found the Laricobius beetles established at 5 sites. But when you release a small insect into the world, and then you try to find another one next year, they've flown off and gone to do their own thing. It can take up to 10 years to figure out whether or not they've established or not. This is part of why biological control research is so slow. So how can you help? Know your PRISM, which it looks like you guys mostly do. You're part of the Finger Lakes PRISM, which is the Regional Invasive Species Management Organization for your region and my region. I sit on their steering committee. Hillary Mosier is the coordinator, and she is awesome. It's the largest PRISM. It has 17 counties in it. If you're a landowner, find the hemlocks that are on your property, know where they are, see if they have HWA, and treat them if they do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also have a citizen science or community science project called My Hemlock, which is great for landowners or people who like to hike in the same place all the time, because you pick a stand, you survey it twice a year, and you let us know what you found for HWA. And you can tell us there's no HWA, or you can give us some information about how much HWA. This is really useful because it helps us plan our biocontrol releases around what's happening with the HWA populations that year, because they fluctuate a lot, because the year after a cold winter, there aren't very many. I think I just told you all of this. So you go to our website, you tell us you want to be a My Hemlock volunteer, you register your site, and then you survey your location twice a year, spring and fall. The other thing you can do is go out to any place that has hemlocks, look for HWA and tell us if you find it. And also tell us if you don't find it, because when we have a map that just has a big blank spot, we don't know if that's because there's no HWA there or because nobody has looked. So those negative HWA reports are really important. For instance, I don't know if there's any HWA at the north end of Owasco Lake, and that would be really useful information. We know it's been found at the south end. It's been there since 2014. But I just have no information about the north end, positive or negative. So it'd be great to get some records from up there. Survey's easiest November through May, because that's when those white woolly balls are visible. It's good to think about the tree health that you're seeing. If you're trying to figure out where to survey, looking for a sick tree is a good starting point. In the winter, you can only survey what you can reach or what you can look at closely, because looking up into the canopy is hard because the light shines between the needles, and it's hard to see if what you're seeing is little white balls or it's just sun. But in the winter, the porcupines go up and they nibble on the tops of the hemlock trees and they drop the branches down, which is great for figuring out what's happening in the tops of the trees. So look for those branches. It's easiest to just find the branches you can reach, turn them over. Hemlock woolly adelgid is usually on the bottom, and just look. And look all around the tree, because HWA infestations are really spotty. So you might see a lot on one side and none on the other side. You can also look from your boats. Just keep an eye out for these ghost trees like this sort of sad grayish looking tree. And in the late May, early June, when the trees have that lime green bud or the lime green new growth, that's a great time to look, because you can scan the lakeshore and say, that one's healthy, that one's healthy, that one's healthy, that one doesn't have any of that lime green growth. Let's call that landowner and get them to look at it. That's the lime green growth. That's a healthy hemlock, healthy crown, green foliage with green new buds, and you can see it's on the lakeshore and it's got those branches all the way down. That is not a healthy hemlock. Declining crown, dead branches, grayish foliage. And you can actually, this is our field manager, Nick. You can see the HWA even from here on that tree. So to report it, the best thing to do is go to IMAP Invasives. It's super easy. You Google New York IMAP, it take you right there. You make yourself a login and you start entering data, or they have this great phone app. You just download the app, you take a picture, it knows where you are, you say what species you found, and just hit upload. It's super easy. You can also use our website. We have a little reporting tool where you just attach a picture, you tell us the address or a GPS and let us know what you found. or you can call the DEC Forest Pest line. So this is what the infestation looks like around Owasco Lake. Steve Kinney, one of our volunteers, found a lot of these points on I think all of these points on the east side of the lake just last winter, and he filled in a lot on the west side. This is Fillmore Glen. It's been there since 2014. This is a 2014 find, and I think so is this one. So it's been right around the lake for a long time. So it's probably a good time to go out and look, especially this year. And I'll tell you why more. But you can see it's all the way up along Cayuga Lake. So it's coming your way with the wind, because those crawlers are light enough that they get dispersed on the wind. They also crawl into birds' feet and get moved around that way. I wanted to share our most recent news, which is that we are sorry to report that we now do have an infestation in the Adirondacks. It was found by a gentleman from New York City who had HWA in his yard, and he was camping and said, I didn't think they had this in the Adirondack, and he put a point in IMAP, which notified DEC, who came out and looked and found it. And my coworkers and colleagues have been out there 3 or 4 days a week for the last 5 weeks helping DEC delineate this infestation. And it's about 1.25 miles of shoreline. It's pretty big. It's mostly spotty and light infestations. And the good news is that DEC is going to be very proactive about this and try to treat the whole infestation, because right uphill of here is a bunch of hemlock forest that's 90% hemlock. If you're a landowner and you have more hemlocks, more than a few hemlocks in your yard or more than a couple of stands, you might be trying to figure out, I don't have bottomless pockets. How am I going to manage my hemlocks? Which ones should I pick if I have to pick some and not others? We actually have a tool on our website to help you think through that, called a prioritization tool. And I used this in this watershed in the Catskills. I just circled all the places that I could see hemlocks on aerial photography, like from Google Maps. And then I used the tool to work through the traits that I could figure out from looking at an aerial map, and scored them. And it gave me a ranking, and the higher scoring things I colored red. Anyway, I just wanted to show this to you as a visual to say that if you have more hemlocks than you think you can treat, this tool will help you think about what the important traits of a hemlock stand might be, so that you would want to preserve one hemlock stand over another. Is it right near your house? Are there going to be hazard trees that are going to fall across your driveway? Is it supporting your stream? Do you have any rare species? Is it a place where your family loves to picnic every summer? All the things that you might want to think through. And then you can either just think through them, or you can use the Excel file attached to score your different stands and see in a quantitative way which ones are highest priority. So to wrap it up, HWA is knocked back by cold weather, but there are 2 things that are telling us that we can't rely on just winters to stop this from spreading in New York. One of them is that our winters are not as reliably warm and cold as they used to be. And the other one is that the HWA is adapting at the northern end of its range to survive colder and colder weather events. And also, it only takes one insect, right? It just takes one bug to survive that cold snap in a semi-sheltered place to keep the infestation going. Treating and surveying for HWA is really critical for managing this pest in New York, and we're hoping that our biocontrol research and the research of all the states around us will move us forward towards a long-term solution for this problem. And that is what I have. There is our website. And if you email that email, it goes to me, it goes to my boss, and it goes to our field manager that you saw. So one of us will answer you. one of us usually has an answer for almost anything somebody asks. It's not always the same person. And that's all I've got.
So are you ready for questions, Carrie?
I would love questions.
So I don't want to monopolize this meeting, which I easily could do. So others, questions first, please?
Could I ask one?
Yes.
Yeah,
I was just wondering, is there, or do you know of any funds that would help private landowners treat their trees? Because it seems like public lands, and then, you know, DEC, whoever's going to have to treat those. Do you know, are there any amounts of money that could help private landowners do that?
Yeah. Can I answer a couple other questions before I get to that one?
Yep.
Right now, I don't mean to ask other questions. So treatment with that imidacloprid is ballpark about $1 per diameter inch. So it's not super expensive. Like if you have a few trees along a stream or you have a small stand, it's very doable. And that's to hire somebody to do it for you. It's less expensive if you do it yourself. Having said that, we have not found great resources for helping landowners. I know some people in the Skaneateles watershed were talking about, so a couple of things. In the Lake George watershed, they've established a fund that get people to donate to every year. And then when HWA arrives in the watershed, as it has now, they're going to use that to support private landowners treating on their property. And also survey. I think Skaneateles has talked about doing that, but I don't think they've done it. So that is an option if your watershed association wants to figure out how to make resources available to homeowners or landowners who don't have the resources to treat their trees. I think it would be worth asking if the regional forester on Friday, Dana, if this falls within EQIP or one of the other federal programs. That's a question I've been meaning to ask, but I haven't cornered a forester yet about it.
Yep. Okay, Carrie, I'm making a note.
Thank you. The only other ray of hope I have is that in the Beaverkill, that watershed that I showed you where we'd done the prioritization, I was doing that because some of the landowners there cobbled together enough funds for us to pay a technician to spend the whole year surveying in that watershed. That's why we were doing the prioritization. Found a lot of HWA. And the landowners and a couple of the public entities in that watershed, and we partnered to write a grant to submit to DEC, not for an individual landowner, but for a whole watershed level treatment. Nobody's done that before, and we don't know if it'll fly, but it's something to keep an eye on.
So Carrie,
Show you a question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Carrie, that request is in this year's funding queue, so to speak. You guys submitted your request in April or May, it sounds like, Beaverkill?
No, we just submitted that. And I need to talk to my boss. It was right around the deadline. And so I don't know if it went in for this year or if we're going to have to wait a whole year to find out.
Yeah, because
okay.
Go
ahead.
I was just going to interject that some of us in the Skaneateles watershed submitted such a watershed-wide request, only $50,000, which sounds like a lot, but I guess it won't treat a huge amount of trees. But we submitted it in April or May and expect notice of the award, assuming there will be an award from the state this month, October.
Okay, that's probably a different pot of money. What pot of money is that?
DEC has a HWA prevention program or a name like that. They make an annual call for proposals. we in the Owasco watershed couldn't do that because we didn't even have enough data as to where our hemlocks are to say nothing about, anything about their health. So we gotta find some, we gotta find them first.
Okay.
So, you know, we have, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Just when you're ready, Carrie, we have 3 questions came in on chat. I can read to the group.
Great.
And you do that now? Rick is asking, why are there no apparently large infestations yet in the Adirondack Park?
Great question. Is it worth trying to go find that slide or not? Here it is. Let me just do that. Yeah. So it started in New York, and it's been spreading from there. It's been spreading more slowly as it gets farther into those really cold areas, because they have more of those reliable cold snaps. So we knew it was in Schenectady, and in Albany, and in Troy, and it's moving, just hopped the Mohawk River 3 or 4 years ago. And then we had one find on Prospect Mountain that was one of those total lucky finds of, you know, somebody was walking through a hillside that doesn't even have a trail, doing some research, and saw it and mentioned it to DEC. That got treated. It was only 3 trees, and it was managed very aggressively, and we haven't seen any more since then at that location. That was 40 miles north of the nearest known infestation, and then this one was another 20 or 30 miles north of that. So we think it arrived on birds. You know, they were started in an infested area, they flew for quite a distance and then stopped at the lake's edge to get some water. And when they perched in those trees, that's when the crawlers crawled off their feet and started the new infestation.
Sorry, go ahead. Rick had a follow-up. I'm going to skip Julie's and come back to it. Rick snuck another question in there. He said, in the solid red areas of infestations in southern New York, are there active treatment programs underway?
So, yes, DEC has done some active treatment. It's actually more in the northern area. They also did Zoar Valley in western New York. A lot of our land trusts are doing active management. Finger Lakes Land Trust has gone through and prioritized the hemlock resources on their properties and has selected a double handful of them to manage. And they've been doing that since before 2015. Cornell Botanic Gardens used to be plantations. They've been treating since the early 2010s as well. The Allegheny Plateau Park has been working pretty hard on their infestations too. So there's nothing regional in the southern area, but there are definitely a lot of treatment programs. Does that answer the question, Rick?
I was curious down by the city where that was all red, and down by New York City in the southern area also. That seems to be
same thing, individual states. Yeah, individual states. Those trees, a lot of them are gone. They went down real faster, and it's been there since the 80s. But HWA infestation is so spotty that there are still places that have healthy hemlock in that region. There was a lot of our Laricobius beetle released in the Delaware Water Gap, and they've spread about 30 miles from there. If we can get the silverfly established down there too, I think we might have a chance at seeing some impact of those. But there's no like regional scale HWA management.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Julie was asking, is there an effect on aquatic species from the pesticides?
So there's a lot of research on that. If you go to our website, we have a whole page devoted to that specifically. There's a woman down in North Carolina, who's doing work on the soil drench method, which again is the least targeted method available because it's the only one that pours chemical onto the ground. She has seen, in a very few cases, she has seen imidacloprid in the stream. And in 2 cases out of all of the ones that she surveyed, she did see a drop in macroinvertebrate populations for a couple of years. But when she came back 4 years later and looked at her control sites that hadn't been treated and her treatment sites, the control sites, the treated sites had better macroinvertebrate populations than the control sites because the imidacloprid had come and gone, but at the control sites, the hemlocks were dead. And that was radically changing the stream ecosystem. Does that make sense?
We have a comment from Nathan Vivone. He says, I'll bring this up to the Wasco Tree Committee. We have been categorizing the trees in the town.
Hey, Nathan, this is Dana. Is Walt Aikman part of that committee, I think?
Yes, Walt is part of the committee. We put this together about a year ago to get Tree City USA and start planting new trees in the town of Wasco. So I know that he has gone around and categorized where and what and how old the trees are. So I will, next week we have a meeting, I will bring it up to see if we have any data specifically on the hemlocks.
Okay, Nathan, thanks for that. And I might mention back to you that several of us, with Carrie's help, have formed a group, and we call ourselves the Owasco Hemlock Hunters, after our parent Cornell Hemlock Hunters. And Walt is part of our Hemlock Hunter organization. So we haven't gone out to hunt any hemlocks yet, to find any hemlocks, but I just want to convey back to you that Walt Aikman is part of our team.
Excellent. We'll have to combine the 2 committees one night.
Good, yes, please, let's do that.
When you
Hey,
think
Carrie?
about hemlock health, make sure that you look for a couple of other things. Drought can have a big impact on hemlocks. So if you have some in an area that would be droughty, they might be impacted by the weather this year. They might not have HWA. And there's also elongate hemlock scale to check for. And if they have that and you want to treat them, use the Dinotefuran too, because that's what manages the scale and the imidacloprid doesn't. Lynn, do you have a question? Her hand raised.
Julie sent in another question. In areas where hemlocks have died off, how long can HWA survive without much of a food source? Excuse me. Is there any hope of eventually replanting them?
That's a great question, and I don't really have a good answer. I know people are replanting, and I also know that there are several researchers that are looking for hemlock, HWA-resistant hemlock in the areas that have already been deeply impacted by HWA. I would say the jury is still out on that. You could certainly replant, especially if you were going to manage for HWA in that location, if you wanted to keep having hemlocks in that location. I've been thinking a lot about what you do in a situation where you can't treat or you have too many trees to treat, and what do you do when you have a hemlock stand that you're going to let go of. And I would encourage you guys to reach out to the Master Forest Owner Program, because they will come out to your property and walk your property with you and talk about forest management. They're a great resource, and they would have really good ideas on how to manage a stand that you're going to transition into something else. If you just let it go, especially if it's a dense stand, you're probably gonna get a lot of invasive species coming in instead of the nice trees, the nice forest that you were expecting. And so I think that if you're gonna let a stand go, you should be actively managing for that.
And Carrie, say again the name of that organization you recommended, Master.
The Master Forest Owners.
Master-
Pacific hemlock species do not thrive in our climate, I'm sorry to say. They don't do particularly well here.
Carrie, you, on one of your slides, you showed or explained that one of these insecticides can be sprayed like the 6 feet of a tree's trunk, but can't the poison also be injected into the tree, and doesn't that then even more mitigate loss of the poison insecticide out into the environment?
So you can put the chemicals, do what's called stem injection, and that involves drilling some holes in the tree trunk and then using a special injector tool to put the chemical straight into the tree. And a lot of our partners do that right along streams because they really want to minimize the risk of any chemical getting into that stream. So that's what Parks does, New York State Parks. That's what the Botanic Gardens do. That's what the Finger Lakes Land Trust does. It's a slower, and so it's a little more expensive than the basal bark application, but I think that there's definitely a role for that, especially right along streams.
And so when we come across a landowner who says, I don't want to have any chemicals sprayed on my property or words to that effect, a way perhaps to reduce his or her concern would be this injection method, right?
The basal bark application is also pretty targeted. Yeah, the stem injection could be even more right there. Nathan had a question about the role that hemlocks play in the ecosystem. They're our most shade tolerant evergreen. They provide direct shade to our water and also hold snow in the watershed later into the spring. So they help cool stream temperatures, which helps stabilize stream temperatures through the winter, especially important for cold water fish streams, trout bearing streams. They help stabilize stream flow, and they provide shelter for a wide range of organisms throughout the year, both being cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter than the surrounding hardwood forests.
Dana, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if either of these two compounds would invalidate farms' organic certifications.
What are you doing on the farm?
I am not. I'm just wondering, that's in the 126th Assembly District and many of these areas, you've got a lot of agriculture, and taking care of these trees would be congruent with taking care of water. But nonetheless, there might be an intersection there where the organic certification would be violated by the presence of this either of those compounds.
That's a great question. Can I write it down and get back to you?
Sure. John Lamondes, I serve on the Onondaga County Soil and Water Conservation District Board, so I'm a huge proponent, but I'm also a farmer, so I know that both sides of this, and I think that's something with the push for all of us to become organic, that would be a question that we would have to answer.
Absolutely. What do you farm?
Myself, we raise sheep, so lamb meat is the primary product, and wool is the secondary, and then maple syrup after that. So I am very concerned with any additives.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that would be the one product that I would wonder about. Would be the syrup. So let me ask.
Yep, thank you.
You're welcome. I know that you guys have been sitting still for a long time. So do you guys have any questions?
Carrie, you want us to let you go to enjoy the remainder of your evening?
I'm okay for another 10 minutes or so, but I also acknowledge that it's a long time to sit and talk about something.
So when you and I have talked, you've emphasized that the time to go out and look for hemlocks and their health is, I'll say, during the depths of the winter, from January 1st until early spring, or even into spring.
I would say on your own property, you can look at health year round.
Uh-huh.
On your own property, you can look for HWA anytime from November to May. May, June, you've got those crawlers out. It's probably not, you could go check one stand, but I wouldn't recommend putting on your hiking boots and spending a whole day going from stand to stand, checking for HWA if you have any positives, because then you might spread it to a new stand. So that's the late spring issue. You can look in the summer, and a lot of the professionals are out all summer long looking for HWA. You just have to be aware that it's super small in the summer. So you can find last year's HWA, but if you're looking for a very new infestation, summer is a challenging time. And then you can start looking as early as November. The only reason that we're not trumpeting November for the Hemlock Hunters program is that we don't want you guys to run into hunters. And they're out from like next week until close enough to the holidays that it's hard to plan a Hemlock Hunter event on a weekend. That's the only reason that we wait until.
Any other questions, anyone? This is a great opportunity to ask and be sure you're doing the right thing or planning to do the right thing. Or...
From a watershed health perspective, the one thing that I don't talk about in this talk, because I'm usually talking to homeowners that maybe aren't as keyed into stream chemistry as you guys might be, but hemlocks cycle nutrients, including nitrogen, very slowly. And when they die, there's a short-term 10 or 15 year pulse of nitrogen into your stream system, which will then pick up in the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, other hardwood trees will come back and they will dominate that area instead of hemlock. Then you have the stream flashiness issue, potentially flooding issues, but also they cycle nutrients more quickly, and so you'll probably see an uptick in nitrogen in the lake in the long term. We just don't have enough data to say that with great authority yet, but that's the direction that the research is pointing for nutrient cycling. Is that useful?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes.
The other thing is that if you have a flashier stream, that means you have more severe flooding events. And if you have a stream that's already a little eroded, if you wind up with higher flood events, you might see more erosion in the long term.
Okay. One more opportunity. Anyone want to try to trap Carrie into yet another question that she may not know the answer?
That would be great. I love questions I don't know the
Can I
answer.
throw one out, Carrie?
Sure.
So just again, from an agricultural perspective, in treated areas, I'm just wondering, a lot of people practice silvipasturing. And so is there, I'm sure there is, but it's probably not known, is there a risk to small ruminants that eat, goats and sheep that will eat these species of trees? Because it's a natural, most of those are natural anthelmintics too. So those are not something that we would try to keep our animals from.
I'm happy to report that the answer is no. Again, this is the same pesticide that is in the flea and tick repellents that go on.
Oh, yep.
So
That's right. You said that. I forgot.
it should not be a problem.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well then, Carrie, thank you very much for your time. Excellent presentation, being patient, answering our questions. We look forward to continue to work with you. We, the Owasco Hemlock Hunters, as you know. So thank you, everyone. Let me mention before we dial off that next month's public forum will be Wednesday, November 4th. And the presenter is probably Bruce Natalie of the Cayuga County Environmental Office. I haven't got him absolutely confirmed, but his topic would be talking about the Owasco Flats and the settling basins and so forth that are happening down there that he's instrumental on. So November 4th is our next forum.
And you'll be a retiree as of the end of October.
Oh, will he? Oh, well, maybe that's why he's not letting me pin him down.
We'll need to recognize him somehow then, I think, after 30 years with the county and environmental planning.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe that's how we can bribe him. Carrie, did you have something further you wanted to say?
I did. I wanted to say thank you, and it was a pleasure to meet all of you. Thanks for the great questions and thinking hard about these difficult situations. If you guys want to receive more information about Hemlock HWA and Hemlock Conservation as it comes available, you can sign up on our website, or you can just shoot me an email and I'll add you to our contact list. We usually add everybody who gives us their email, but I don't know which ones of you want that and which ones don't. So.
Good. Well, thank you again, Carrie. Thank you, everybody who's dialed in and listened and asked questions and so forth. So best of the rest of the evening to you all.
Thank you all for letting me
Thanks,
participate.
Carrie.
I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
A quick note on the Owasco Flats, the Finger Lakes Land Trust has purchased, I forget how many acres, but right along the inlet, they've added property in the flats to their collection of property. So there's more protection happening there.
And as you probably know, Nancy, so is the Nature Conservancy, TNC.
Yes, yeah, that was earlier, but this is brand new.
Oh.
That's wonderful news. Maybe they'll
Finger
let you guys
Lakes.
survey their property.
That would be great. So.
Okay, good night all.
Good night. Thank you,
Night.
Carrie.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.